The night started like any other for Rob and Michelle Reiner, a couple who had lived lives most people could only dream of. Wealth, fame, respect, they had it all. But sometimes, the most dangerous storms arise where we feel safest, hidden behind walls of privilege, behind smiles captured in photographs, and behind the carefully curated public image of perfection. What if the very people you love most are the ones who sense the danger before you do? What if warnings are whispered and ignored, leaving a path of irreversible tragedy? For the Reiners, this nightmare was real, and it began long before the events of December 2025. In the early days of that fateful month, Jake Reiner, the eldest son, felt an unease he couldn't shake. He had tried to voice his concerns. He had tried to warn his father about the potential danger lurking closer than anyone could imagine, within the walls of their own estate. But warnings from children, even grown ones, are often met with disbelief. Parents see their children through the lens of love and past mistakes, not necessarily as messengers of peril. Rob, a towering figure in Hollywood, had built a life where rationality, humor, and confidence framed every interaction. And in that life, warnings from his son Jake did not carry the weight they should have. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Jake knew the signs. He knew the patterns of his younger brother Nick, who had struggled for years with substance abuse, periods of homelessness, and mental health challenges. It wasn't simply teenage rebellion or a phase. It was a history of erratic behavior, manipulation, and moments of deep, unpredictable rage. Nick had been a family member who, despite opportunities and resources, had often acted as if the world, and especially his family, owed him something. Entitlement is a subtle thing. It grows quietly, like a seed in the dark soil, until it can uproot everything in its path. Jake watched as that seed seemed to grow stronger each year, nourished by the comforts of wealth, a lack of accountability, and unheeded warnings. But warnings are rarely heeded until it is too late. And sometimes, even when they are heard, they are rationalized, dismissed, or forgotten. Jake's attempts to speak were met with polite nods and distracted smiles. "Nick's your brother," Rob would say. "He's had his struggles, but we love him. We'll manage." It's a natural parental instinct to protect, forgive, and hope for the best. But hope can be dangerously misleading. And in this story, hope would prove insufficient. The Reiners' Brentwood estate was a sprawling $13.5 million property, complete with manicured gardens, security cameras, and multiple guest houses. From the outside, it was a picture of tranquility, the kind of home where family dinners were punctuated by laughter and where Hollywood's elite might drop by for a private chat. But behind the gates, tensions simmered. Relationships that once held promise now bore the marks of strain. Conversations that should have addressed problems often skirted around uncomfortable truths. The veneer of wealth and success can sometimes obscure the cracks in the foundation until they fracture completely. December 2025 was supposed to be a quiet month for the family, but quiet moments are deceptive. Rumors of Nick's escalating frustration and reckless behavior had begun circulating among close friends. Those who had known the family for years whispered about a dangerous combination of entitlement, addiction, and simmering resentment. And yet, the Reiners appeared publicly as a picture of normalcy. They attended events, shared social media posts, and maintained a facade of a family that had conquered life's obstacles. This contrast between public perception and private reality is at the heart of why tragedies like this strike with such shock. The world sees perfection, but inside the home, danger quietly builds. Jake had pleaded with his father, cautioning that Nick's behavior could escalate. "He's not okay," Jake said. "Something is wrong. You need to see it before it's too late." These conversations were not casual remarks. They were urgent, charged with fear. But fear is often easier to dismiss than confront, especially when it comes from someone we love. Rob's love for his son, tempered by disbelief and hope, created a blind spot. It's a human flaw, one that has been repeated in countless stories, from history to headlines, where warning signs were dismissed until catastrophe struck. On the night of December 17th, 2025, the tragedy unfolded. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found brutally murdered in their home. Their son Nick, 32, who had been living in the guest house, was arrested that same night. He faced 2 counts of first-degree murder. The discovery was made by their daughter Romy, 27, whose own account to police would later reveal the horrifying premonition she had about a dangerous family member. She had warned authorities that someone close to the family should be considered a suspect, a warning that, in the end, would tragically prove true. What happened in the moments leading up to the murders? What was Nick feeling, thinking, or planning? And why did Jake's warning go unheeded? These are questions that haunt the story, lingering in the minds of family, friends, and a stunned public. They are the kinds of questions that make us reflect on our own families, our own ability to perceive danger, and the consequences of ignoring intuition. The case captured the attention of the world not only because of the fame involved, but because it struck at something deeply human. We are all vulnerable to blind spots. We all hope our loved ones will not betray us or succumb to destructive patterns. And yet, even the most attentive parents, the most vigilant siblings, and the most caring children can fail to prevent a disaster when the signs are subtle, misunderstood, or ignored. As we explore this story, the pieces will begin to fit together. We will see how a lifetime of struggles, Nick's mental health issues, substance abuse, and sense of entitlement, intersected with family dynamics and human error to create a perfect storm. We will follow Jake's perspective, Romy's testimony, the police investigation, and the shocking revelations that the media would later uncover. Every chapter, every moment, every conversation that went unheard or unnoticed will be brought into focus. But the most chilling part of all is this: Jake tried to warn them. He tried to prevent this. And yet, despite his best efforts, the tragedy occurred anyway. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes the people closest to us see the danger first, and that the consequences of not listening can be catastrophic. So what exactly did Jake say? How did Rob react? What signs were ignored? And what could have been done differently? The answers are buried in years of family history, personal struggles, and emotional conflict that the public never saw. And as we peel back each layer, the story becomes more than just a headline. It becomes a study of human nature, trust, and the limits of foresight. By the end of this video, you will understand not only what happened, but why it happened. You will see how one son's voice, filled with urgency and fear, collided with the world of fame, privilege, and denial. You will witness the domino effect of ignored warnings, and you will come face to face with the shocking truth that no one saw coming. But before we can reveal the full story, the first question you must ask yourself is this: how can love and hope sometimes blind us to danger? And how far can a warning go unheard before it is too late? Jake's warning was real. His fear was real, and the consequences were devastating. The story that follows is not just about a family tragedy. It's about human flaws, misjudgments, and the heartbreaking reality that some warnings, no matter how clear, are ignored until the unthinkable happens. The world had always seen Rob and Michelle Reiner as the embodiment of success. Rob, a towering figure in Hollywood, was more than just a director and actor. He was a cultural icon, a man whose career spanned decades and whose influence touched generations. Michelle, elegant and composed, was the anchor of the family, managing both the household and the public eye with a grace that made the Reiners seem untouchable. On the surface, they had it all: wealth, fame, and a picture-perfect family. But appearances can be deceiving, and often, the more perfect the image, the darker the truths it hides. For years, the Reiners lived in a world where success and security created a comfortable bubble. They owned homes, traveled extensively, and mingled with Hollywood royalty. Their lives were chronicled in glossy magazines and tabloid headlines, portraying a family that had overcome life's obstacles and emerged on top. Friends and acquaintances admired them not only for their professional accomplishments, but also for the sense of normalcy they seemed to maintain despite their public profile. To outsiders, the Reiners' life was enviable. Yet within this seemingly idyllic world, tension had quietly been building. Like cracks forming in the foundation of a grand house, subtle signs of trouble appeared, often dismissed or overlooked. Nick Reiner, the youngest son, had long been a source of concern. From an early age, he struggled to find stability. His life was punctuated by periods of homelessness, substance abuse, and behavioral issues. While Rob and Michelle loved him deeply, they sometimes failed to fully grasp the depth of his struggles or the potential consequences of ignoring them. Jake, the eldest son, had always been the responsible one. He was careful, thoughtful, and observant. Unlike Nick, Jake tried to follow a structured path in life, seeking to achieve stability and success on his own terms. But over the years, he had become painfully aware of the volatile dynamic within his family. He had witnessed firsthand the patterns of Nick's behavior, the anger, the entitlement, the self-destructive tendencies, and it had left him worried. Deep down, he feared what could happen if these warning signs were ignored. Family gatherings were often a study in contrast. On one side, Jake's quiet rationality and sense of responsibility. On the other, Nick's unpredictable mood swings and growing resentment toward the privileges he felt he had earned by birthright alone. It wasn't just the material wealth that created tension. It was the perception of inequality and the unspoken rules of a household where love, success, and protection sometimes blurred boundaries. Despite these tensions, Rob and Michelle remained steadfast in their love for both sons. They believed in the power of guidance and discipline, in the importance of patience and understanding. But love alone is not always enough to navigate the complexities of mental health struggles and deep-seated resentment. The family's wealth and prominence, which should have been tools for support, sometimes became shields that prevented true confrontation with reality. Publicly, the Reiners maintained their perfect image. They attended events, posed for photographs, and shared moments on social media that painted a picture of harmony. Friends described them as approachable and generous, a couple who had balanced professional success with personal fulfillment. But behind closed doors, the narrative was different. Conversations that should have addressed Nick's growing instability often skirted around uncomfortable truths. The veneer of perfection masked a simmering tension that would eventually erupt in ways no one could have anticipated. Jake often felt trapped between his parents' desire to maintain peace and the urgent warnings he wanted to convey. He saw danger, he understood the patterns, and he tried to communicate his concerns. But in a household accustomed to politeness and careful management of appearances, his warnings were easily dismissed as worry or overreaction. The family's love, which was sincere and profound, ironically became a blind spot, preventing them from fully grasping the imminent threat within their own walls. Friends and neighbors recalled moments that, in hindsight, seemed ominous. Nick's erratic behavior, sudden mood swings, and confrontational episodes were often chalked up to stress or youthful indiscretions. Yet Jake saw the larger pattern, the subtle signs that indicated a deeper problem, one that could no longer be ignored. He had witnessed how Nick's entitlement had grown over the years, fueled by a combination of family wealth, lack of accountability, and untreated mental health issues. It was a dangerous mix, and Jake knew that the family's safety could be at risk if these issues were not addressed. The estate itself, a sprawling $13.5 million property in Brentwood, was both a sanctuary and a potential trap. With its high walls, security systems, and multiple buildings, it offered safety from the outside world. But safety can be deceptive. The true danger was not external. It was internal, hidden in plain sight. The home, meant to be a haven, became a stage where underlying tensions played out in private, unnoticed by outsiders. As December 2025 approached, the tension in the household intensified. Nick's behavior became more unpredictable, his resentment more apparent. Jake's warnings grew more urgent, yet the parents, perhaps blinded by love or disbelief, did not fully act. The dynamics of the family were complex, love and hope clashing with fear and frustration, reason colliding with emotion. Every interaction, every ignored warning, added to the mounting risk. Even as friends and neighbors noted changes, the Reiners' public image remained intact. The dichotomy between perception and reality is a hallmark of high-profile families, and the Reiners were no exception. Outsiders saw a picture of wealth, success, and familial love. Inside the walls of the estate, a different story was unfolding, a story of warning signs, ignored concerns, and a growing sense of impending crisis. Jake's perspective provides a crucial lens into this hidden world. He saw what others could not or would not acknowledge. He recognized the patterns in Nick's behavior, the warning signs that suggested an escalation was possible. And yet, despite his efforts, he was unable to penetrate the bubble of disbelief that enveloped his parents. It is a tragic irony. The son who perceived danger most clearly was powerless to prevent it. The tension reached a breaking point as December 2025 progressed. Jake's warnings became more desperate, more insistent. He tried to communicate the gravity of the situation, but the combination of parental love, denial, and hope created a barrier. The family's failure to fully address these warnings would have catastrophic consequences. What was it that Jake saw that his parents did not? How did the patterns of Nick's behavior escalate into something deadly? And what moments could have changed the outcome if they had been taken seriously? These questions would later dominate conversations, news reports, and investigations, as the shocking truth of that December night came to light. But before the tragedy, before the arrest, before the world learned of the brutal murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, there was a family caught in a dangerous limbo. A family whose love, wealth, and fame could not shield them from the storm that was brewing within. Jake Reiner had always been a careful observer, someone who noticed what others overlooked. He wasn't the kind of person to overreact or blow situations out of proportion, but by December 2025, he could no longer ignore the signs. His younger brother Nick, who had long struggled with substance abuse, mental health challenges, and an unpredictable temperament, was escalating in ways that Jake found deeply concerning. And for the first time, Jake realized that the danger was not theoretical. It was imminent, real, and potentially catastrophic. It started with subtle changes. Nick had become more withdrawn, oscillating rapidly between moments of charm and sudden, inexplicable anger. Family conversations, once lighthearted or routine, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Friends of the family noticed it too. Comments about odd behavior, cryptic social media posts, and sudden disappearances were becoming increasingly frequent. But these warning signs, visible to those who knew where to look, were dismissed by Rob and Michelle as temporary setbacks, typical struggles of a young adult dealing with personal issues. Jake tried to articulate his concerns to his father. He chose his words carefully, knowing that an accusatory tone could be counterproductive. "Dad," he began one evening, "I'm worried about Nick. He's not just having a rough time. He's spiraling. I think there's a real risk here, and we need to pay attention before something serious happens." Rob, as he often did, listened patiently, but with a polite detachment. "I know you're concerned, Jake," he replied. "Nick has had his challenges, but we've handled tough situations before. He's our son. He's family. We'll manage." But Jake knew it wasn't that simple. He could see the patterns forming, the subtle signs that indicated Nick's sense of entitlement was growing alongside his instability. Nick had begun to act as if he were owed access to the family's wealth and lifestyle, yet he had not made the effort to stabilize his own life. Substance abuse had created moments of impulsivity and irrational thinking. Periods of homelessness had left him with deep-seated resentment and a distorted sense of reality. The combination was volatile, and Jake feared that it was only a matter of time before it erupted. Jake's attempts to warn his father were persistent. He pointed to specific incidents: Nick's increasingly aggressive confrontations during family interactions, suspicious disappearances, and financial demands that went beyond reasonable expectations. He described how Nick's behavior suggested not only frustration, but an underlying sense of entitlement that could easily escalate into violence. Each conversation ended similarly. Rob nodded, expressed concern, but ultimately believed that the family love and his authority as a parent would prevent things from spinning out of control. But Jake was not the only family member to notice the tension. Romy, the youngest sibling, had her own reservations. She had observed moments of manipulation and mood swings from Nick that unsettled her. While Jake approached the situation analytically, Romy experienced an emotional intuition, a gut feeling that someone in the family could be dangerous if circumstances deteriorated. Her instincts, like Jake's, were ignored by those who saw the Reiners' public image as one of stability and success. Despite their warnings, Rob and Michelle continued to operate under the assumption that love and guidance were enough to manage Nick's behavior. They relied on their years of experience, their understanding of family dynamics, and the hope that Nick would stabilize if given the right support. But Jake's fear was rooted in evidence, in observation, and in patterns he had tracked for years. He had learned to recognize the precursors to violent or self-destructive behavior, and all of them were now present in his brother. Jake's frustration grew as the days passed. He attempted to involve external support, therapists, counselors, and even friends who might intervene, but Nick's behavior was erratic, making it difficult to establish a consistent plan. The more Jake pushed, the more resistant Nick became, and the more dismissive Rob appeared to be of the severity of the situation. It was a pattern that had defined much of Nick's life. Warnings given, help offered, and opportunities squandered. The warnings escalated to a point where Jake feared for his parents' safety. He noticed subtle signs that Nick might not only act out impulsively, but could also direct anger toward those closest to him. Conversations within the family became increasingly tense, each interaction layered with unspoken fear. Nick's entitlement, combined with his instability, created a dangerous cocktail. And while Rob and Michelle tried to mediate and maintain calm, the cracks in the household structure were widening rapidly. Friends of the family would later recount moments that, in hindsight, seemed like missed opportunities to intervene more decisively. There were disputes over money, sudden arguments over trivial matters, and unexplained absences that left the household on edge. Jake saw these as red flags, but without a visible, immediate threat, his parents remained hopeful rather than vigilant. The difference between seeing a potential danger and perceiving it as a real, immediate threat is subtle, but it is a difference that often separates tragedy from safety. As December progressed, Jake's attempts to warn his parents became more urgent and specific. He would describe scenarios in which Nick's behavior could escalate to violence, outlining the risk in stark terms. But the combination of parental love, disbelief, and hope for reconciliation created a barrier that Jake could not penetrate. Rob, for all his intelligence and experience, could not reconcile the image of his son with the potential for harm. Michelle, equally devoted, could not imagine that her child would be capable of such an act. The stakes could not have been higher. Jake knew that if his warnings were ignored, the consequences could be catastrophic. He saw the trajectory of Nick's behavior as a ticking time bomb, a pattern that, if unaddressed, could result in irreparable damage. And yet, despite his vigilance and concern, he remained powerless to compel action. The tragic irony was that the son most aware of the danger was the one least able to prevent it. This chapter of the Reiner's story is crucial because it illustrates a universal truth. Warnings, even when clearly stated, are only as effective as the willingness of others to listen. Love, hope, and denial can all serve as obstacles to perceiving danger accurately. Jake's struggle highlights the tension between familial loyalty and the responsibility to act in the face of risk. His story is not just a prelude to tragedy. It is a reflection on the human tendency to ignore uncomfortable truths, even when they come from those we trust the most. So what exactly did Jake say? What did he predict, and how did he frame his warnings to his parents? And why were these warnings ultimately dismissed until it was far too late? The answers lie in the intimate details of family interactions, psychological patterns, and the complex interplay of love, fear, and denial. As the days drew closer to the fateful night, the tension within the Reiner household became almost palpable. Jake's warnings, Romy's unease, and Nick's volatile behavior created a perfect storm. Everyone in the family was aware, at some level, that something was off. Yet, the enormity of the risk remained unacknowledged by those who could have taken decisive action. And then, in December 2025, the situation reached its breaking point. Jake had done all he could. He had spoken, observed, and warned. But warnings alone cannot prevent tragedy when disbelief and hope overshadow the stark reality. The night that followed would become a turning point, a moment when all the ignored signs converged with devastating consequences. The question now is not just what happened, but why it happened, and how one son's desperate attempts to protect his family were tragically insufficient. But the full story, and the shocking truth of what occurred, would only emerge in the hours that followed. A truth that would leave the world stunned, questioning how such a tragedy could happen within the walls of one of Hollywood's most iconic families. Nick Reiner's life had always been complicated, But complexity is often a word that masks deeper, more dangerous realities. To the outside world, he was simply the son of Hollywood royalty, a man with opportunities, resources, and connections most people could only dream of. But beneath the surface, Nick's life was a turbulent mix of addiction, mental health struggles, instability, and entitlement. Understanding Nick is essential to understanding how the tragedy of December 2025 could unfold with such devastating inevitability. From a young age, Nick exhibited a combination of charm and volatility. Friends and family often described him as charismatic when he wanted to be, able to light up a room with laughter or a clever remark. But beneath that charisma lay patterns of behavior that signaled deeper struggles. He would oscillate between periods of intense energy and sudden withdrawal, moments of generosity and unexpected aggression. These cycles became more pronounced as he entered adulthood. Substance abuse was one of the most persistent challenges in Nick's life. It was not just occasional experimentation or casual misuse. It was a recurring, destructive pattern that affected every aspect of his life. Alcohol, prescription medications, and other substances created a feedback loop of temporary relief followed by exacerbated emotional instability. Friends recall episodes where Nick's behavior became increasingly erratic, his decisions unpredictable, and his mood swings alarming. The Reiners, like many families, faced the heartbreaking dilemma of loving a person while grappling with behaviors that could be dangerous to themselves and others. Mental health issues compounded the difficulties. Nick struggled with depression, anxiety, and other disorders that affected his judgment and perception of reality. Therapy and counseling were inconsistent, sometimes interrupted by his own resistance, other times by circumstances that made sustained treatment challenging. It's a cruel irony of human nature. Those who most need help are often the least able or willing to accept it. Nick's untreated issues created cracks in his behavior that widened over time, allowing resentment and entitlement to grow unchecked. Entitlement was a central theme in Nick's life. Growing up in a household defined by fame and success, he had access to resources and opportunities that others could only dream of. Yet rather than inspiring gratitude or motivation, this privilege seemed to fuel a sense of expectation. That the world, and particularly his family, owed him a certain lifestyle, attention, and respect. Combined with his personal struggles, this sense of entitlement created a volatile mindset. Nick believed that if things did not go his way, he was justified in expressing anger or frustration, sometimes in extreme ways. Periods of homelessness punctuated his adult life, highlighting the instability that coexisted with privilege. Nick would sometimes leave the family home or find himself living in temporary arrangements, unable to maintain consistent employment or stable housing. These periods were marked by self-reflection at times, but more often by further deterioration, substance abuse, financial instability, and increasingly erratic behavior. For Jake and the rest of the family, these absences were both worrying and emotionally draining. Each return to the family home carried tension. Would Nick be calm and cooperative, or would old patterns of anger and manipulation resurface? Family members tried to intervene repeatedly, but interventions are delicate. They require a combination of timing, willingness, and support systems, all of which were inconsistent in Nick's case. Jake, in particular, felt a heavy responsibility to protect not just his brother, but the entire family. He observed patterns, predicted escalation, and tried to communicate concerns clearly to his parents. Yet every attempt to bridge the gap between warning and action was met with a mix of disbelief, denial, or hope that things would stabilize naturally. Nick's behavior was not only a private family concern, it had public dimensions. Friends and acquaintances noted his erratic conduct, and there were occasional reports in the media of minor incidents or public displays of frustration. Social media, often a window into a person's private thoughts, provided glimpses into a psyche struggling with anger, disappointment, and an increasing sense of being wronged by those around him. These public hints, however, were often overlooked or dismissed by those who assumed that family and fame provided sufficient structure and support. The intersection of addiction, mental health issues, and entitlement created a perfect storm. Nick's impulses were unpredictable, and his emotional responses were amplified by substances and untreated psychological conditions. Friends recall incidents where he would lash out at minor provocations, sometimes verbally, sometimes in ways that suggested he could act physically. These behaviors were alarming, yet they were often rationalized as the temporary consequences of stress or personal struggle. Jake saw these patterns for what they were, warning signs that escalation was likely. But patterns, as he knew, are often invisible to those who are emotionally invested. Rob and Michelle, despite their love and experience, were caught between hope and denial. They wanted to believe that Nick could be guided back to stability, that interventions and discussions would suffice, that love alone could prevent disaster. Unfortunately, these hopes were not grounded in the reality of Nick's escalating behavior. Financial entitlement played a role as well. Nick often viewed family resources not as support, but as something owed to him. This sense of entitlement was compounded by his inability or unwillingness to maintain a stable personal life. Arguments over money, property, or perceived slights became increasingly frequent, adding tension to an already strained household. For Jake, these conflicts were clear signals that Nick's grievances were deepening, and that the potential for violence was rising alongside them. By the end of 2025, Nick's life had become a tinderbox. Each day presented a risk. Each interaction carried a subtle tension that could ignite conflict. Jake's warnings were urgent, Romy's instincts were uneasy, and yet the adults in the household continued to believe that love and guidance could contain the situation. But love alone cannot disarm volatility. Patterns ignored, entitlement unchecked, and struggles untreated can converge into tragedy, a lesson the Reiners would painfully learn. Friends, neighbors, and therapists would later provide insight into Nick's behavior, painting a picture of a man trapped between desire, addiction, and resentment. His actions were not entirely unpredictable. They were the logical culmination of long-standing patterns that, if addressed, might have prevented the catastrophe. But intervention requires recognition, timing, and decisiveness. In the Reiners' case, these elements did not align. Understanding Nick's troubled life is not about assigning blame alone. It is about contextualizing the tragedy that followed. Every moment of instability, every outburst, and every ignored warning contributed to an environment where the unthinkable became possible. It was the interplay of human frailty, familial love, and unacknowledged danger that created the conditions for disaster. And as December approached, the risk escalated. Jake's warnings became more insistent, the family tension more palpable, and the sense of impending crisis impossible to ignore. Nick's troubled life, with all its complexities, was now on a collision course with the lives of those who loved him most. Families are complex, even under the best circumstances. Add wealth, fame, and personal struggles into the mix, and the complexity multiplies exponentially. For the Reiners, what may have appeared from the outside as a picture-perfect household was anything but. Behind the manicured lawns, elegant walls, and Hollywood smiles, the family's dynamics were fraught with tension, unspoken grievances, and unresolved conflict. By late 2025, the pressure within the Reiner household had reached a breaking point, and the cracks that had been forming for years were beginning to widen dangerously. Jake, the eldest son, had long observed these dynamics with a combination of care and frustration. He understood that his role in the family extended beyond being a son. He was often the voice of reason, the observer who tried to see clearly where others were blinded by love or hope. He noticed patterns in interactions, subtle signs of manipulation, and the emotional triggers that could set off his younger brother, Nick. But being perceptive is not always enough. In a family, perceptions can be dismissed, ignored, or rationalized away, and Jake often found himself in that exact position. Nick, for his part, had developed a complicated relationship with each family member. He alternated between seeking approval and challenging authority, between moments of genuine affection and bouts of resentment. His sense of entitlement toward the family's wealth and lifestyle exacerbated conflicts. He could not see himself as accountable in the ways Jake or even his parents expected, and every perceived slight, no matter how minor, became magnified. These interactions created a constant undercurrent of tension, which in turn created stress for the entire household. Romy, the youngest sibling, played a unique role in this dynamic. Observant and intuitive, she had seen patterns in her brother Nick's behavior that others, including her parents, had overlooked. While Jake approached the situation analytically, Romy processed it emotionally. She felt unease in moments that seemed ordinary to others. She would later describe the sense of foreboding she felt in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, a gut instinct that a family member posed a serious threat. Unfortunately, intuition, no matter how strong, can be difficult to act upon when those around you are operating under denial or hope. Parental dynamics also added to the pressure. Rob and Michelle, despite decades of experience and wisdom, were deeply influenced by their love for their children. They wanted to see the best in Nick, to believe that his struggles were temporary or fixable. Their hope for reconciliation and normalcy created blind spots. They dismissed or rationalized warnings because to acknowledge them fully would mean confronting uncomfortable realities about the child they loved, a child they may have feared was capable of real harm. Love, in this case, became a double-edged sword, blinding them to the escalating danger inside their own home. Family interactions were further complicated by the public scrutiny that accompanied the Reiners' lives. Every argument, every visible sign of tension, had the potential to become a public spectacle. For a household accustomed to managing appearances, there was pressure to maintain composure, to hide conflict, and to project a facade of harmony. Yet the very act of hiding conflict can amplify internal stress. Conflicts left unspoken fester, resentment builds, and emotions that are suppressed find other, sometimes destructive, outlets. Jake often found himself acting as a mediator, trying to diffuse tension and interpret warning signs for his parents. He approached each situation with logic, citing specific behaviors and patterns that indicated escalating risk. He was meticulous in his observations. The way Nick's tone would shift, the subtle signs of manipulation, the moments when anger flared without provocation. But mediation is only effective when all parties are willing to acknowledge reality. And in this household, acknowledgement was often secondary to hope, love, and denial. Nick's perception of the family further complicated dynamics. He often interpreted guidance as criticism, love as conditional, and concern as control. His entitlement, combined with a history of being shielded from consequences, fueled a sense of grievance. In his mind, he had been wronged, overlooked, and misunderstood. These feelings, left unaddressed and festering, were powerful motivators, capable of pushing interactions toward volatility. The household's daily rhythm reflected the pressure. Ordinary tasks became fraught with tension. Family dinners, once a time of connection, became moments of careful navigation. Conversations were layered with subtext. A simple remark could trigger anger, a well-intentioned comment could be perceived as criticism, and efforts to maintain peace often required delicate negotiation. Emotional energy, in such an environment, was constantly taxed, leaving little room for calm or rational decision-making. Friends and neighbors recalled moments that, in hindsight, were ominous. Small arguments escalated unexpectedly, moods shifted unpredictably, and the Reiners' usually composed demeanor sometimes cracked under pressure. Outsiders saw flashes of normalcy, but had no way of understanding the cumulative stress building behind the estate's high walls. To the casual observer, the Reiners appeared stable and loving. But within the family, the interactions were like a slowly ticking clock, each moment bringing them closer to a breaking point. Jake's frustration with the family dynamic grew alongside his fear. He tried to communicate to Rob and Michelle the seriousness of the situation, emphasizing that Nick's behavior was not just an annoyance or phase. It was a pattern that could escalate to violence. He reminded them of past incidents, pointing out repeated behaviors and patterns of manipulation and anger. But love and hope, as powerful as they are, often override logic. Rob and Michelle, devoted to their son, found it difficult to reconcile the image of Nick they wanted to see with the reality Jake described. And then there was the element of isolation. Even in a household filled with resources and connections, family members can feel trapped. The Reiners' prominence meant that intervention from outsiders, friends, therapists, or authorities, was complicated. Privacy concerns, social image, and personal pride limited options. This isolation, combined with escalating internal tension, created an environment in which conflict could reach dangerous heights without intervention. By late December, the family dynamics had reached a critical stage. Jake's warnings had grown more insistent, Romy's intuition more urgent, and Nick's behavior increasingly erratic. Every day that passed without decisive action increased the risk of a catastrophic outcome. The household was a pressure cooker. Love and loyalty mixed with resentment, denial, and volatility. And in such conditions, it takes only a single spark to ignite tragedy. The Reiners' story in this period is a stark reminder that even families defined by love, wealth, and success are not immune to the destructive forces of miscommunication, denial, and unresolved conflict. Family dynamics, when left unchecked under pressure, can amplify risk rather than mitigate it. In the Reiners' case, the combination of Nick's struggles, Jake's warnings, Romy's intuition, and the parents' hope created a perfect storm, one that would soon explode in ways no one could have predicted. December 16, 2025, began like any other day on the Reiner estate, yet beneath the calm exterior, tension was simmering like a storm about to break. The sprawling Brentwood property, with its high walls and meticulously maintained gardens, had always been a sanctuary for the family, a place where wealth and comfort masked the complexities of everyday life. But on this day, the facade of peace was fragile, and the undercurrents of fear, frustration. December 16, 2025, began like any other day on the Reiner estate, yet beneath the calm exterior, tension was simmering like a storm about to break. The sprawling Brentwood property, with its high walls and meticulously maintained gardens, had always been a sanctuary for the family, a place where wealth and comfort masked the complexities of everyday life. But on this day, the facade of peace was fragile, and the undercurrents of fear, frustration, and foreboding were impossible to ignore. At least for Jake Reiner. Jake had woken early, as he often did, his mind immediately consumed by concern for his younger brother Nick. Over the past weeks, Nick's behavior had become increasingly erratic, swinging between charm, agitation, and simmering resentment. Jake had tried to discuss these patterns with his parents repeatedly, emphasizing that Nick's struggles were more than temporary setbacks. They were warnings of escalating danger. But like many families caught between hope and denial, the urgency of his warnings was largely dismissed. As the morning unfolded, Jake observed subtle but alarming signs. Nick was agitated, pacing through the guest house where he lived, muttering to himself, and reacting sharply to minor provocations. Small disagreements with staff or delivery personnel quickly escalated into heated exchanges. Jake could see the familiar patterns forming. Frustration, entitlement, and a growing sense of grievance that seemed to dominate Nick's thoughts. Every gesture, every raised voice, every sharp glance was a piece of a puzzle that, to Jake, spelled danger. The family attempted to maintain normalcy. Rob and Michelle moved through the day with their usual composure, hosting meetings, returning calls, and keeping up appearances. But beneath their calm exterior, tension was palpable. Rob, for all his experience and intelligence, struggled to reconcile the image of Nick he wanted to believe in with the behaviors Jake described. Michelle, deeply empathetic and protective, tried to mediate without escalating conflict. In the living rooms and kitchens of the estate, the delicate balance between hope and fear was being tested minute by minute. Interactions between Nick and his parents were particularly strained that day. Small requests or corrections were met with resistance, defensiveness, or sarcasm. Jake, watching from a distance, could see the escalation of frustration, the tightening of emotions that often preceded volatile outbursts. He tried to intervene where possible, attempting to de-escalate situations, yet the family's dynamics made it difficult to assert authority or prevent conflict without exacerbating tension. The day was also marked by subtle signs that external pressures were weighing on Nick. Emails and messages reflecting financial frustrations or perceived slights arrived throughout the morning. Social media posts hinted at resentment, envy, and a growing sense of being wronged by those around him. These external triggers, when combined with his internal struggles and the stress of family interactions, created a dangerous emotional cocktail. By afternoon, the tension had spread throughout the household. Jake noticed that Romy was unusually quiet, her instincts alerting her to the danger that lurked in the family's midst. She moved carefully, avoiding confrontation but watching Nick's movements with concern. Even small interactions, like dropping a dish in the kitchen or misplacing a phone, were met with disproportionate frustration from Nick. Jake, sensing the escalation, tried once again to articulate the risk to his parents, urging them to take preventive measures, to establish boundaries, or even to involve outside professionals. Yet despite the warning signs, the day continued without decisive intervention. Rob and Michelle, like many parents, were caught between love, denial, and hope. They wanted to believe that Nick's behavior could be managed, that patterns of past frustration would not escalate into something dangerous. But hope is often a dangerous companion in the presence of real risk, especially when combined with entitlement, mental health struggles, and long-standing resentment. Even the household staff felt the tension. Conversations were clipped, movements cautious, and the usual flow of the estate disrupted by a sense of unease. Everyone who observed the interactions could sense that something was off, but no one could predict the magnitude of the storm that was approaching. As evening approached, Jake's anxiety intensified. He had tried repeatedly to warn his parents about the trajectory of Nick's behavior. He had documented incidents, provided examples, and urged them to recognize the danger before it was too late. But love, familial loyalty, and disbelief created barriers that even his persistence could not overcome. The hours before the tragedy were punctuated by ordinary activities overlaid with extraordinary tension. Dinner preparations, casual conversations, and routine tasks carried the invisible weight of unspoken danger. Every gesture, every word, every interaction was fraught with significance. Jake's warnings echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the potential consequences of inaction. By late evening, the sense of foreboding had reached a peak. Nick's agitation, combined with the family's attempts to maintain calm, created a volatile mix. Jake and Romy, acutely aware of the potential for violence, prepared themselves mentally for the possibility that their concerns could soon be realized. They had done all they could to prevent the inevitable. Yet, as history would show, some forces, once set in motion, cannot be stopped, even by love, reason, or desperate warnings. This day, ordinary in the eyes of the outside world, was the calm before a storm that would change everything. The interactions, the warnings, the subtle cues, and the mounting tension all converged in a way that made tragedy almost inevitable. It was a day marked by fear disguised as normalcy, by invisible danger hidden behind a veneer of routine, and by a family caught between hope and the harsh reality they were too late to prevent. And then, in the darkness of the night that followed, all the warnings, all the concern, and all the tension would culminate in a horror no one could have imagined. What happened that night would not only shock the family but the entire world, and the details of that evening would reveal just how close tragedy had been before it struck. December 17th, 2025, began with an eerie stillness that belied the horrors soon to unfold. On the Reiner estate, the air was thick with tension that had been building for weeks, months, and even years. Every interaction, every glance, every unspoken word from the day before had set the stage for the unthinkable. And on that night, the storm Jake had feared for so long finally erupted, leaving a trail of devastation that would stun the world. Nick Reiner, 32, had spent years grappling with a volatile mix of entitlement, substance abuse, and untreated mental health struggles. These forces, once manageable through family intervention and therapy, had reached a tipping point. The warning signs that Jake had been sounding for months were no longer hypothetical. They were urgent, and tragically, they were ignored, or at least not fully acted upon, by those who loved him most. The evening began with ordinary activities, masked by the ordinary rhythms of family life. Rob and Michelle, unaware of the full magnitude of the danger looming over them, moved through their home with calm composure. Jake and Romy, however, were acutely aware that something was off. They noticed Nick's behavior had become unusually tense, his agitation more pronounced. Words were clipped, movements were abrupt, and there was an intensity in his gaze that set off alarms in their minds. From the guest house where he lived, Nick had access to the main house, a detail that would prove critical in the events that followed. The estate's sprawling layout, normally a comfort, became a conduit for the tragedy. The home, designed for privacy and security, offered no protection against the danger that originated from within. In retrospect, every feature of the property, the guest house, the unlocked doors, the absence of immediate security intervention, became part of the tragic calculus that allowed the violence to occur. The confrontation began in ways that seemed almost banal to an outsider. Arguments over trivial matters, miscommunications, and minor provocations escalated in intensity. Nick's sense of grievance, fueled by years of perceived slights and entitlement, reached a critical threshold. He no longer viewed his parents as guides or protectors, but as obstacles, or perhaps, in his distorted perception, as adversaries. Jake and Romy tried desperately to intervene. They attempted to de-escalate the situation, to calm Nick, and to redirect his focus. But the emotional and psychological volatility that had been building for years now surged unchecked. Efforts at mediation proved futile. Nick's impulses, shaped by unresolved anger, frustration, and the reinforcing patterns of his troubled life, drove him toward a course of action from which there was no turning back. The violence, when it erupted, was sudden and brutal. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were stabbed in their own home, victims not only of their son's actions, but of a series of preventable circumstances. The details of the attack reveal a chilling combination of premeditation and impulsivity. Nick, who had long struggled with self-control, now acted with lethal decisiveness, targeting the very people who had nurtured and protected him throughout his life. Jake's warnings, the months of observation, the repeated attempts to alert his parents, none of it could undo what was happening in that instant. The family's dynamics, the history of conflict, and the fragile balance between hope and reality culminated in a tragedy that was almost inevitable given the factors at play. Every ignored warning, every rationalization, every attempt to maintain peace without confronting the underlying issues contributed to the disaster. Romy, who discovered the bodies, was confronted with the unimaginable. She had long sensed that a dangerous family member might act out, yet nothing could prepare her for the scene that greeted her. The shock, horror, and grief she experienced in that moment would echo throughout the investigation and the media coverage that followed. Her testimony later revealed the depth of her awareness, the intuition that had gone unheeded, and the pain of realizing that a loved one could commit such an act. Nick was arrested that very night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The swift law enforcement response ensured that he was taken into custody before he could flee, but the damage was irreparable. The Reiner family, renowned for their wealth, status, and public image, had been irreversibly shattered. The tragedy highlighted not only the personal failings and struggles within the family, but also the dangerous consequences of unaddressed mental health issues, entitlement, and familial denial. This night, horrific in its immediacy, was the culmination of years of warning signs, missed interventions, and escalating risk. Jake's repeated alerts, Romy's intuition, and even external observations could not prevent the outcome. The intersection of mental illness, personal grievances, and opportunity created a perfect storm, and the Reiners' lives were destroyed in an instant. The murder shocked the world not only because of the prominence of the family, but because it reflected a chilling universal truth. Tragedy often arises not from unknown threats, but from familiar ones. Danger, when ignored or rationalized, grows quietly within the spaces we consider safe. The Reiner story is a stark reminder that even in lives filled with wealth, love, and resources, the combination of denial, entitlement, and untreated struggles can have catastrophic consequences. And yet, as shocking as the event was, the story was far from over. Investigations would reveal details that no one could have anticipated, exposing even deeper truths about the family, their dynamics, and the circumstances that allowed the tragedy to occur. What followed in the aftermath? The legal proceedings, the revelations from friends and family, and the public reckoning would reveal a picture more complex, more disturbing, and more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The night of December 17, 2025, marked the beginning of an investigation that would captivate the world and expose the darkest corners of the Reiner family's private life. Nick Reiner, once seen by friends and acquaintances as a troubled yet familiar figure, was now a suspect in a double homicide that had left his family shattered. His arrest was swift, almost inevitable, given the circumstances, but the layers of the investigation that followed would reveal a far more complex and chilling reality than anyone could have anticipated. Law enforcement arrived at the Brentwood estate hours after the bodies of Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were discovered. Romy, 27, had made the discovery, entering her parents' home to find the unthinkable. Her presence at the scene added urgency and credibility to early warnings that authorities might have otherwise overlooked. According to her statements, she had long been concerned about a dangerous family member and had even tried to alert the authorities preemptively about Nick's behavior. In the end, her instincts proved tragically accurate. Nick was found in the guest house where he had been living, a detail that immediately made him the primary suspect. The proximity to the victims, combined with his known history of behavioral issues, entitlement, and instability, created a strong initial case for investigators. He was taken into custody without incident, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Hollywood, the media, and the public, who struggled to reconcile the image of a wealthy, prominent family with the brutal reality of the crime. From the outset, investigators faced a complex web of family dynamics, personal history, and behavioral patterns. They had to sift through years of Nick's troubled life, his struggles with substance abuse, mental health issues, and periods of homelessness, while also considering the context of family interactions and long-standing grievances. This was not a simple case of motive and opportunity. It was a deep dive into psychological patterns and relational dynamics that had been ignored or underestimated for years. One of the central questions investigators sought to answer was whether the murders had been impulsive or premeditated. Nick's behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime suggested both planning and emotional volatility. Reports indicated that he had become increasingly agitated, making financial demands, exhibiting entitlement, and reacting aggressively to perceived slights. Friends and acquaintances would later testify that he had expressed frustration with his parents' authority, their expectations, and the limitations imposed upon him by both family and society. Jake and Romy were both questioned extensively. Their testimonies provided crucial insight into the family's internal struggles and the warnings that had been given. Jake described how he had repeatedly cautioned his parents about the potential danger, citing specific incidents that demonstrated escalation in Nick's behavior. Romy corroborated these concerns, emphasizing her own unease and the intuition that a family member posed a real threat. Together, their statements painted a picture of a family aware of the risk, but ultimately powerless to prevent it. Investigators also had to examine the role of the estate itself. The sprawling $13.5 million property, with its guest house and multiple buildings, allowed Nick proximity to his parents while giving him space to act independently. Security footage, access points, and staff interviews were meticulously reviewed to understand how the events unfolded and whether any intervention could have altered the outcome. Every detail, from the timing of entry to movement patterns within the house, was scrutinized to reconstruct the final moments of the Reiners' lives. The media coverage of the arrest and investigation was intense. Headlines focused on the shocking nature of the crime, the fame of the family, and the apparent betrayal by a son against his parents. Public fascination grew not only because of the prominence of the Reiners, but also because the story touched on universal fears, that danger can reside within the most familiar and trusted relationships. Commentators debated the factors that led to the tragedy, analyzing mental health, entitlement, family dynamics, and missed warnings. Each report added layers to the narrative, creating a picture that was both horrifying and mesmerizing. For law enforcement, the investigation was not just about determining guilt. It was about understanding context, motive, and risk. They had to consider the psychological profile of Nick Reiner, assess whether interventions might have prevented the crime, and analyze the family's responses to previous warning signs. The complexity of the case went beyond forensic evidence. It was a study of human behavior, family dynamics, and the consequences of unheeded warnings. Throughout the investigation, shocking details emerged. Friends of the family revealed long-standing concerns about Nick's entitlement and instability, describing incidents that had previously been private or dismissed. Financial pressures, disputes over lifestyle, and patterns of emotional manipulation were all documented. Even small arguments that seemed trivial at the time now took on a terrifying significance in hindsight. Every overlooked warning, every rationalized behavior, and every attempt to maintain peace without addressing underlying issues became part of the narrative that explained how the tragedy occurred. The arrest and investigation also raised broader questions about responsibility, prevention, and accountability. Could this have been prevented if Jake's warnings had been fully acknowledged? Was there a point at which intervention might have changed the course of events? And how does one balance parental love with the necessity of recognizing real danger within a family? These questions would dominate discussions among psychologists, law enforcement, and the public, highlighting the universal tension between hope, denial, and reality. As the investigation unfolded, the Reiner estate transformed from a symbol of wealth and comfort into a scene of trauma and forensic examination. Police meticulously documented every detail, reconstructing the timeline, collecting evidence, and interviewing all who had insight into the family's life. The case became both a criminal investigation and a psychological study, revealing the hidden pressures, struggles, and warnings that had preceded the fatal night. But even with exhaustive analysis, one question lingered above all. How could a family so wealthy, so connected, and so attentive fail to prevent a tragedy that seemed increasingly predictable? The answer lay in a combination of factors: human denial, love clouding judgment, untreated mental health issues, and escalating entitlement. It was a perfect storm, and Nick's arrest marked only the beginning of uncovering the layers of dysfunction, warning, and tragedy that had accumulated over decades. And as the investigation deepened, more shocking revelations came to light.